And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Becca and Ryan.
Thanks, Margaret. Well, Ryan and I are very excited to talk to this group of people. You are from all over the place. I think we have people from different time zones and people from different professional affiliations. And we often talk about this project to our colleagues at a science and management conference or to the managers of the Teanaway Community Forest. So we're very excited to talk to a more assorted group of folks, and also like a lot of our relatives are here, and that's really fun too. So thanks for coming, family. Before we started our slides, I wanted to give you a little bit of context for how an effort or a project like this comes to be prioritized. And to do that, I want to refer to some work that came from NOAA Fisheries in 2013 to think about, as our climate is predicted to change, what can we do to make our salmon stocks resilient to the predicted changes in climate? And here in the Yakima watershed, our predictions are that we'll receive more of our precipitation as rain and less as snow. And because of that, we'll see peak flows in our rivers earlier in the season, and they will be flashier, and we'll see lower flows during our low summer flows during base flow than we see now. And we'll probably see warmer stream temperatures as a result. Well, in the Tim Beachy paper from 2013, they looked at a range of the typical actions that salmon restoration practitioners implement. And they identified that the most effective way to make our salmon stocks and our salmon habitat resilient to climate change is to work on connectivity. So to work on longitudinal connectivity so that salmon can make it into a greater length of stream. And that's taking care of barrier culverts and other blockages to fish passage. And then it's also looking at lateral connectivity. Is the river able to utilize its floodplain and move around and spread out and use that sponge effect that we think of in storing things in the floodplain? And then vertical connectivity. Is the bed of the river able to have its connection and overflow its banks in the way that it would in a non-degraded system? And when those pieces are either functioning or restored, we see that we've created habitat that beaver can use. So beaver restoration and recolonization of beaver turns out to be the most effective tool we have for increasing resiliency to climate change. With that context, when we look at a river system and try to think about how we can continue to make it be good fish habitat into the future in our changing climate, Mid-Columbia Fisheries and Yakama Nation are doing that with an eye towards connectivity and ultimately with an eye for, can we pull this system to a place where the beavers can take over and manage it for us? Because they've been doing it a lot longer and they're a lot better than we are at this job. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about what we know about the Teanaway River system, what we've done restoration-wise in the past couple of years, and then how a project like this is developed from a science and modeling perspective. Ryan's going to lead us through that. So I will start by just talking a little bit about the Teanaway watershed. So the state of Washington acquired more than 50,000 acres in the Teanaway watershed in 2013 with the goal of being able to preserve and restore fish and wildlife habitat while helping to secure water supply for the Yakima Basin and accommodating the traditional uses of the watershed. Those traditional uses include uses that came before Euro-American settlement. So the Yakima people, the Kittitas band of the Yakima people, have used this watershed since time immemorial for village locations, for resource use, for travel, for fisheries, for berry gathering. And it continues to be, in present day use, a critically important area for seasonal round and subsistence approaches. So it's very fitting that the Yakama Nation is a leader in the restoration of fisheries in this watershed. When we think about what happened when Euro-American presence began to be felt on the landscape, the first thing we think about is beaver. The Hudson Bay Company was very effective at trapping and selling pelts from beaver, and beaver were pretty much eliminated from our landscape by the mid-1800s. That was a dramatic impact on river, stream, and wetland ecosystems in our area. This is a picture from Colorado that is representative of how we think many of our watersheds were looking. They were a series of dams and wetlands in different stage of progress. Those impounded waters behind the dams were very rich for salmon rearing, especially coho, really love that stuff. And fish were able to move up and around those dams through the side channels that developed. Well, even after the beaver had been trapped out, we still saw natural processes in the form of wood inputs to the river. Tim Abbey, a geomorphologist with natural systems design, found this photo in a 1909 textbook that shows that in the Middle Fork Teanaway at that point, log jams were channel spanning and very long and very effective at shaping processes in the river. Unfortunately, right around the same time, the primary method of transporting timber from the watershed was through log drives. So logs would be felled into an impoundment behind a splash dam. When the water from the splash dam was released, the force of that water would move the logs all the way down the Teanaway, down the Yakima, and to the mill site, which was in the city of Yakima. Well, the force of that water was strong enough to scour the bed of the river down to the underlying bedrock. And we haven't seen the river recover from that yet. When you are recreating in the river, that bedrock is pretty fun to play in, but it's actually the scar that's left over from those splash dams. Well, splash damming was kind of labor intensive, and so railroads replaced it around 1916. And the easiest way to build the railroad tracks was to build them right along the banks of the river. So if we're thinking back to that idea of connectivity, we lost the beaver influence. Then the scour from the splash dams pulled the bed of the river down, decreasing its vertical connectivity. And then the railroad built berms or dikes on at least one side of most of the river forks, which prevented it from being connected laterally. And then finally, from a human management perspective, we continue to use the watershed for grazing, but the grazing density that we see there now is considerably less than what was there historically. And oftentimes when you're walking in the floodplains in the big open meadows, you can feel compaction on the soil, almost like you're walking in a city or in a city park rather than in a natural area. And that's the legacy of a lot of sheep and a lot of cows over the years. So as a quick way to sum it up, we used to think we know that we had log jams that were shaping the river, log jams like this. Now we get kind of excited if we see, ready, Ryan? At least a piece of wood in the river. So, and when we do see wood in the river, we're looking at wood that's usually at the greatest, maybe 24 inches in diameter. This ponderosa, which has slowly been moving its way through the Noth Fork Teanaway River, is a 2-foot diameter tree. Prior to the timber management in the watershed, trees that were recruited to the river could have been 4-foot diameter trees. Different condition than that we would have seen prior to the mid-1800s. And that matters. The Teanaway watershed is habitat for steelhead and chinook, and the Yakama Nation is planning to reintroduce coho in the near future. And the simplified stream system that's resulted from those management actions is providing very limited habitat to those fish species. When we have flat channels that are uniform like this, we're lacking pools, and we think now that we're actually lacking in spawning habitat as well. These data show the steelhead reds, or the nests where the fish lay their eggs, that were counted from 2012 to 2014, and the Chinook reds. At that time, we were seeing a lot of spring Chinook usage in the Noth Fork Teanaway River, and that has declined dramatically since then. And the managers of the spring Chinook acclimation facility on the Noth Fork Teanaway attribute that to the lack of spawning gravel. So when I show something that might be a little bit hard to see, you actually have a plus sign on the right-hand side of your window that will magnify. So you can zoom in if you want to take a closer look at like the smiling face of that steelhead. When the Teanaway Community Forest lands came into public ownership, a group of restoration practitioners from NOAA Fisheries, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources, and Yakama Nation, did I miss anyone there? Mid-Columbia Fisheries, I was sitting there, came together to build an aquatic restoration strategy. And we looked at where we had the highest functioning habitat that we could move into preservation status the most easily, and made that the highest priority. That was the Noth Fork Teanaway. It was also the largest watershed area and the area that has traditionally had the greatest anadromous, or salmon and steelhead, use. The Middle Fork and the West Fork Teanaway are listed as medium priority here, and we're at a point where we're beginning to start our work there. So they're not forgotten, they're coming next. With an eye towards connectivity, when we look at these stream systems, we're looking for how we can spread flood flows out to store water in these floodplains that are publicly owned. By focusing on doing that here in the headwaters, in the land that we all share ownership of, we're actually helping to protect the private lands downstream by decreasing flood impacts there. We also think that there's the potential to help store water, to hold it on the landscape longer by doing that. And we're looking to restore fish habitat. We want to give those fish deep pools to hold in. We want spawning gravel so that we have greater production in the system. We want to see places where they can take refuge during high flows and refuge from predators. With the Noth Fork Teanaway as our first priority, the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board and Yakama Nation hired a geomorphologist, Hoda Sendosi, to look at the existing data about the Noth Fork Teanaway River and identify where we could have the greatest impact on increasing connectivity. Through that process, we identified a 4-mile reach on the Noth Fork Teanaway River between Indian Creek and all the way up to Stafford Creek, which is just about the northern extent of the state-owned land. This reach of river also had the advantage of being 2.5 miles upstream of the private land. If you are a private landowner living on the river, it's a little intimidating to know that folks are wanting to do work right upstream from you. We reached out quite a bit to the landowners in the Teanaway. We had several public meetings, and we assured them that we would start our work well above the private land. And the Yakama Nation was issued a permit to be able to go and modify restoration projects if it appears that they might in any way threaten the private land downstream. We also looked at the safety of recreationists in the river. The Teanaway River is a very fun place to play. We're not proposing to do restoration work in places like this. This is the Slippery Rocks area on the Noth Fork Teanaway River. Now, with your new eyes, you recognize that what we're seeing here is the legacy of splash damming and log drives. But if you're just out trying to find a nice place to play on a summer day, you see a good place to play. And we don't want to do anything that would put the recreationists there at risk. So we're not working there. We've also posted scoping signs about the project at recreational access points, and we've had articles in the newspaper. And we've had public meetings, and we've put it all over social media and made presentations to groups like this. We also did some not as exciting things, like secured quite a bit of public funding to implement restoration work and secured quite a lot of permits to do so legally, but that doesn't make for a good presentation. So we're going to skip right to the question of, why is there a tree dangling from the top of this picture hanging over the river? All right, ponder that. I'm going to take you through some of the work we've done and leave you wondering why that tree is dangling there. We started in 2019 at the downstream part of the reach that was identified as a priority, right by the Indian Middle Creek area. And we identified 3 places where we wanted to install large wood trapping structures. Now, this came out of a preliminary design report that was completed by AMEC in 2013. And I'm super excited because the engineer who was the lead on that is on this call. Thanks, Mike. So at that point, we designed structures that would act as analogs for the old growth trees that no longer fall in the river and start to form jams. So we planned to install 3 of those at the Indian Middle Creek site and another 3 just immediately upstream near Shirk Creek. And with the thought that when those big engineered trapping structures, wood structures, were installed, we'd have some points where wood would collect and gather. We also worked to design unanchored structures that could work in concert with those. So this is what those large wood trapping structures look like. And Pat Powers with Waterfall Engineering did the final design and construction oversight of these and was also involved in the earlier process. So they started by having piles installed as ballast to hold them in place. And then we mimicked an old growth tree. So this is the participatory part of this presentation. Everyone hold up your arm. If you don't have your camera on, that's okay. And think about your elbow to your wrist being the stem of a tree, or the bowl of the tree. And then your hand is the big root wad. Now, if you are an old growth tree, this bowl is 4 feet in diameter. And so your root wad is probably at least 8 foot, maybe 12 foot in diameter. This is a big structure. And when it fell in the river, it often would orient itself with the stem downstream and the roots pointing upstream, just because of hydraulics. And anything that was mobile in the system would get caught up in that big root mass. Okay, now squint at your screen. That's what we're mimicking with these large wood trapping structures. The logs that are oriented upstream are mimicking the root mass, and they will collect things. In fact, in this picture, they have already begun to collect things that are mobile in the system. And then multiple logs, 14 logs, are placed to mimic the strength and the weight of the bowl that holds the structure in place. Good job participating, everybody. So when those 6 wood trapping structures were in place, the Yakama Nation then worked again with the geomorphologist, Hoda Sendosi, to install unanchored but still carefully designed flow splitter and deflector structures that would work with the flow to eat away a bit on the banks and start to reconnect the floodplain.
Yeah, hey everybody, this is Ryan.
Yeah, here's the big reveal, everybody.
Yeah, hi. As their name implies, these structures split and they deflect flow in a particular direction. In the Yakima Basin, we have pretty limited funding for salmon recovery collectively, and so we're always looking for alternatives to do as much work as we can for the least amount of money. And these structures are pretty darn cheap to build. It's all built in the dry, and they're super active when the flows come up. So yeah, we installed 7 of these in 2019 near Indian Creek. And then the big reveal, the reason there was a root wad hanging from the sky is we placed around 1,000 logs and logs with root wads with a helicopter, in addition to all the other structures. And if you can see this big gravel bar right here, this is pretty exciting to us because after 1 year, this gravel bar, which wasn't here before, is already forming, and the root wads are becoming embedded and getting buried already. So this is really encouraging. I'll talk a little bit more about why that is really cool in a little bit.
Okay, well, we were really, really thrilled with the work we were able to accomplish in 2019, but we were really only a third of the way through the restoration priorities that had been identified for the Noth Fork Teanaway. In 2020, we worked with a second construction firm. We had worked with Reclaim in 2019, and we're very pleased with their work. In 2020, our contract was awarded to Thayer Excavating, and we continued our work with Pat Powers and Hoda Sendosi to install 3 additional large wood trapping structures near the confluence with Jack Creek. These structures were a little different than the ones we put in 2019. We didn't like the digging aspect of the 2019 work. So in 2020, our engineer, Pat Powers, worked to create enough ballast above the stream bed that digging was really minimized. So if you go out there to take a look at them, these 2020 structures are really large. Like one of the construction personnel said, I feel like I'm building a giant tree fort. They're real noticeable out there, but over time they will start to settle down, and our construction footprint was much, much smaller than it would have been if we'd had to dig in. We also took down this strange little berm that was on the left bank of the river. We think this was here to protect the adjacent field from when it was in cultivation and grazing. But this river really needs gravels. So we were happy to be able to lower this down. We sifted the material in the berm and put the boulders in the wood trapping structures to weight them down. And then we placed the gravels and the cobbles in areas of the river that had pretty high energy during the annual flow. This is a drone shot showing how that gravel replenishment looked. So when we placed them in August, the areas we put them were dry, but probably last month when flows came up like that, they were already getting moved and worked by the river. And we expect that over several seasons, those gravels will all be recruited back into the stream bed. The nice thing about doing it that way is that we didn't need to worry about adding silt to the river at a time when flows are really low. And instead, that'll just go into the river when the water's already pretty brown in the spring during runoff.
Yeah, so then 2020, we installed another 18 flow splitter deflector type jams near Jack Creek, and then also in between Jungle and Stafford Creeks. And I just wanted to call attention to this gentleman here. I know a lot of really good operators in the Yakima Basin. This is Tim. He's right up there. Really good operator. If you were curious. So here's some other views of those structures. It's kind of cool to watch this develop over years, and so seeing how the structures are being modified, learning things as time goes on. Yeah, and then we added around 900 more pieces of large wood near Jack Creek, and then also between Jungle and Stafford Creek. And this is an example of the area between, it's about a quarter of a mile upstream of the Jungle Creek confluence. Yeah, so we've talked a lot about the who, what, and why, and I'm going to attempt to talk about some of the technical things that go into getting to the point of actually physically monkeying around with the river, and use the work that we're proposing for 2021 as an example. So I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone here. This reach here that we're looking at, I'm hoping everyone can kind of see what's going on here. I know some folks have issues looking at LiDAR hillshades, so the river is right here to help kind of orient your eye. That's where it's at currently. And so we're just, well, the project last year ended right about here. And so all of 2021 is really about attacking this strange topographic feature that persists on this landscape. The berm, it spans most of the floodplain, and then it also constricts the channel longitudinally through this section here. We don't know. Oh, here's a photo of me next to the structure where that arrow is pointing to kind of give you a sense of scale. We always assumed this was a splash dam, but then as we went through the geomorphic assessment and the aerial image analysis, 1954, it wasn't present. And if it was present, that would suggest it was a splash dam, because obviously that predated that photo. So we really don't know what that is. There is a lot of strange topographic features throughout the Teanaway Community Forest. Here's an example of a splash dam. We know this one for sure is a splash dam because it's got the sluiceway here. So back in the day, they would close that sluiceway off, impound water, fill it with logs, and when they were ready, they'd pull the plug and let the logs loose and chase them all the way to Yakima. And so some of the things that came out of the geomorphic assessment is a lot of the secondary channels and former channel alignments were mapped out, and that's what you're seeing with the dotted blue lines. Another big one is this area here, which is, you can't really tell too well, but the surface is essentially just a humongous gravel bar, and we think that that's a function of a backwater that has occurred because of this berm, or we're calling it a berm now. And so it's basically storing gravels upstream. We also, that'll be important later as we go through here. And then we also interpolated where the former railroad alignment was located, and that's the red line here, and it just passes right through that berm. And I put this picture in just so you kind of see what size wood they were working with back in the day. Those are some big logs, and it's challenging to find wood like that nowadays for these projects, and we're we don't really want to use those because those are our old growths around here. Allison Gray from Central Washington University, graduate student, mapped all the former channel alignments, and so now we're to help orient, we're looking upstream is at the top of your screen there, and downstream's at the bottom. So west is to the left. Here's the 1954 channel alignment, and it's been working its way to the east. Here's a 1978. 98, when I graduated high school, it was in the alignment of the former railroad alignment, which you can kind of make out here. And now it's literally stuck between a rock and a hard place. And here's what it looks like from the ground. So the hard place is here's the berm. You can kind of make that out. And then notice all the bedrock and the large cobble sizes here. These are like volleyball to basketball size cobbles. You don't see much fine gravel in there or spawning size gravel because it's just getting evacuated every year. And that's our rock for the rock on the hard place. So I've got a video here to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So this is from some of the hydraulic modeling. So what's encouraging about looking at this, so this is at a 2-year flow event. And if you don't know what a 2-year flow event is, there's a 50% chance of this flow happening in any given year. What's encouraging is we do have some overbank flow and some other channels being connected when flows come up. What's not encouraging is the high velocities flowing through this channel. The red represents high velocity. I think it's like 15 feet per second, and the blue is low velocity. And another way to think about this, Mark Teskey at WDFW has this great analogy. So imagine that you have a house that has no rooms. It's just a hallway. So you have nowhere to kind of hang out, chill. You have nowhere to eat food. You're constantly stepping on Legos and Hot Wheels with bare feet because you don't have a bedroom. This is what fish are dealing with here. There's nowhere for them to get out of this high flow, off-channel habitat to eat or have cover to evade predators, really just to make a living as a fish. And here's kind of another thing to think about. So rivers kind of go through evolution. The stage 1 is sort of a healthy system where the river's well connected to its floodplain. And then if you think about like, so wood deteriorates over time and eventually it flushes out of the system if you have a log in the river. If you have impacts to the new introductions of wood, so like if the riparian gets hammered and grazed by livestock, or there's some sort of logging thing that, whatever it is, where wood is not being input into the system anymore, the river just incisors, and it incisors down to bedrock, and under like normal conditions, it would actually widen and causing bank failure, and then you end up with a nice inset floodplain, and the process kind of starts over again. But we're kind of stuck here in the incision zone because there's a berm just keeping it locked into that position. And then if you think about it, bringing it back around to beavers, if you're trying to build a beaver dam, it's pretty tricky if you've got deep flow with a lot of stream power, just tearing your dams apart as soon as you build them. So we think we have a solution to this problem. What we're proposing in 2021, 6 more of these flow deflector structures. And it's worth noting that this structure here, let me get the laser. This structure here is going to be engineered. Pat Powers is working on that at the moment. And the reason that needs to be engineered is this is super high velocity, as I showed you before. And we need this to stick around a really long time. We're confident these guys out here, the white circles, are all going to stay put. But this one's pretty critical to force that flow in this direction and help wet up that floodplain. And so in addition to that, we want to remove portions of the berm. We did some modeling essentially just looking at inundation acreage if we remove the entire levee versus portions of the levee. And it wasn't a great enough gain to remove the full levee, and it costs a heck of a lot more to do so. So we've kind of opted for this and just doing part of the berm. And I guess it's worth mentioning, you know, these structures are going to continue to, they're set up in locations where they're going to continue to just chew apart the remnants of the berm over time. So, and then if you remember before when I was talking about this giant gravel bar up here, you can kind of make out these little blue scallops right in here. Those are the log jams that we placed last summer. And those, in addition to a few more that you can't see on the map, are set up to continue to chew apart that gravel bar and keep gravel moving through the system instead of locked up in a location where it's not usable. So like when we do remove the portions of the berm, there's going to be a lot of material to deal with, and we're going to sift that out and use everything we possibly can to give it back to the river. We think it came from the river to begin with, and add it to these locations where the red polygons or red rectangles are, because those are high energy locations where we know it'll get transported downstream to the log jams that, hopefully the log jams that we installed in 2019. And just to talk, you know, a little more about the importance of gravel in these systems, you know, spawning is critical. Like, you know, that's a limiting factor here. We don't have any deep pools, and like I can think of like 3 deep pools in this whole 4-mile reach where we've been working. And so the thought is we get this gravel and sediment transport thing moving, and we'll get gravel bars developed and gravel sorting, and eventually we'll build it up enough that we can scour nice deep pools for fish to use. And then we're also, you know, bringing the bed elevation up so that the floodplain is more frequently engaged with the river, and we're storing water and sort of meeting all these goals that Becca spoke about. So here's another way to explain this. So these are velocity profiles in the main channel at that same flood event. So the blue line at the top of each of these images is the 2-year flood recurrence water surface elevation, and the red line is the actual channel bed. You'll notice that, and same thing, you know, red is high velocity, blue is low velocity, and you can see it's like, you know, 10 feet per second and higher in places. That thing's cranking when it's flooding. And then here's the proposed condition, and it's all, you know, 3 feet per second, nice low energy moving through there, with the exception of this location. And this is where the engineered log jam is going, and we want that to be a high velocity spot. We're gonna, you know, to force that flow over onto the floodplain. And I actually have one last video. So this is the proposed condition model. So the black dots are the splitter and deflector structures. And I think the big takeaway here is, if you remember from that original video, this main channel was just lit up with red and orange, and now it's spread out over this broad floodplain. And that's what we're trying to do. And then, you know, it also shows how we're forcing energy at the remaining bits of berm that's going to still be there. Yeah. And so we've had a pretty good monitoring program going on with this project. A lot of photo monitoring, you know, ground-based with our iPhones, but also as Becca mentioned, I get to use a drone for work, and so we're doing 2D aerial maps every year. So it's almost like we're monitoring the effects of this project in real time. I mean, we're looking at it each year, which means it's undergone all of the physical sort of changes that the hydraulics acting on the wood will produce. And I see Dan Scott's on the call. I'm not going to put him on the spot, but he is a postdoc from University of Washington, and he got funding, I think, for 10 years to come back and perform, you know, physical measurements of the log jams and determine how wood stability and jam characteristics and hydrology impacts the stream morphology. So we're super fortunate to have him. He's doing a lot of great work. It's worth noting that that hammer in my hand isn't a regular size hammer. That's my daughter's hammer. But I'm pounding in it. You know, daughter hammers are great for tagging wood, it turns out. So I'm putting a numerical aluminum tag in each piece of wood and getting a waypoint. So that's another way we can look at how these things are working, and you know, see how the pieces of wood are moving around, and we got it pretty much locked down, you know.
We're excited about the monitoring that Dan is doing, but really what we're looking for as an indicator of success can be seen in this photo. If the beaver come in and tell us that they can be building dams now in these lower velocity areas with greater connectivity, then we've met our objectives. And you know, they're just a lot smarter than we are, so we trust their monitoring results.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, before we close here, I struggle with the term restoration in this context because I feel like we're sending the watershed on this trajectory of greatness, but really we're just waiting for the physical and biological factors to take over. So once we get that sediment working through here, the gravel's working through, and the beaver take over and build more log jams. I mean, this is like the pinnacle of success if you're a habitat biologist, to have a beaver dam, build a dam on your wood. But all these things collectively over time, you know, that's when the restoration is occurring. We're just putting the infrastructure, the missing parts back in. So I think that's worth noting.
So with that, we just want to show a list that's almost certainly not totally inclusive, but you know, this work relies on many partners, and it relies on public funding and the public ownership of this watershed. So everyone on this call is a contributor to this restoration work through your tax dollars and your support of the acquisition of this property. Thank you for that. And this is an amazing opportunity to have the state of Washington invest in land like this with the goal of long-term protection and restoration. And I'm incredibly grateful to be able to work in an area like this, and just really trying to make the beaver proud. So with that, I think, Margaret, do you want to give directions for questions?
Sure. That was great, Ryan and Becca. Thank you. And I can unmute people. We can unmute people for questions. And there was one already in the chat box from Albert. Would beavers be introduced? Would beavers be introduced?
That is timely. We just met on that today, and there was a Yakima beaver project about 5 years ago that was actively reintroducing beaver, and it's been on hiatus. But the Yakama Nation is interested in getting that moving again. So we are thinking within the next couple of years there should be an opportunity to trap beaver that are causing problems for private landowners lower in the watershed and relocate them to these public lands.
Awesome, thank you. Marty has a question. What are the opportunities for citizen science and volunteering?
Hi, Marty. So we have had some great volunteer contributions so far. I'm looking at Pat and Dave, who have both helped us with planting and with seeding and mulching. The Trout Unlimited, the Upper Yakima Headwaters, has been monitoring West Slope cutthroat populations in this part of the watershed. It's one of the only efforts that I'm aware of to get a real handle on how West Slope cutthroat populations are doing. And then Mid-Columbia Fisheries has volunteer interns every summer who assist us with the monitoring of restoration projects. So as we're moving forward, there will be more opportunities to track how things are going. And you're always welcome, Marty. I'll pick you up on the way.
Jeff has a question about beavers. What are beaver eating and using for dam material? And are you adding the plants they need?
So we have not done extensive planting in concert with this, although we did put in 2,000 live stakes of essentially beaver food last year in the areas where the stream banks had been disturbed by our construction activity. So beaver food is predominantly willow stakes, cottonwood stakes, to a lesser extent, dogwood stakes and alder stakes. So we were planting with an eye towards helping the banks to stabilize, but I wouldn't mind if that looked like a smorgasbord we made for them.
We forgot to talk about, we kind of experimented, we got, 2,000 live stakes and like stuffed these log jams full wherever we had water when we built these jams. Like if we're digging out a bar for one of those splitter deflector type structures or in the wood trapping structures and there's open water where we could get the live stakes feet wet, and we thought they'd be successful. We did so, and like we added an abundance of woods live stakes. So pretty excited to see how that works, because that should really lock these structures together if they're successful.
Yeah, and Ryan, I just saw that Eileen Gowdy just left the call, which prevented us from saying it was mostly Eileen who put in 2,000 live stakes in those log jams and side channels. Eileen works with the Yakama Nation.
Jim Marquette has a question about the origin of the wood that was put in the project. Was it imported from outside of the Teanaway drainage, and if so, why?
You want to speak to the wood sourcing, Ryan?
Yeah, so we didn't talk much. There was a whole phase of, so we're calling these things phase one. So we're working through the priority tributaries, and we're almost done with the Noth Fork Teanaway phase one. Then we're moving over to the other forks. But this is adaptive work, so we're anticipating coming back in when we're done with the West Fork, Middle Fork, and making adjustments. I mean, that's my plan, is to see where we still need to do work in the tributaries, and then go back and look and see what still needs to be done in the North Fork, maybe make adjustments to what we've already done. But anyways, so back to the wood question. So the tributary work, we actually thinned WDFW overstocked forests in the Tanum for the majority of that wood. And then for the North Fork, it's been mostly sourced by the contractor. And I know a lot of it comes from clearing jobs in Suncadia. but it's kind of hard. Ideally, we would get it within the Teanaway Community Forest, but we're not quite there yet.
So none of the wood has come from outside the upper Yakima watershed, for the folks that don't know those place names, but we have not been sourcing it from the Teanaway watershed.
Are there other questions? Oh, here's one, I think from Joel Hubble. What's your take on the availability of gravel to recruit into the channel, given its splash dam history?
Well, I know in the reach we were just discussing, so upstream of the berm, there's gravel galore, and then the actual gravel that we're generating is going to go a ways, but you know, we need to kickstart a lot of these physical processes to start generating a good gravel supply and keep it moving through the natural, you know, naturally. But what would your take on that be, Becca?
Well, I do see a lot of gravel coming in from further upstream. We have talked about the role of the roads, especially the Noth Fork Teanaway Road that parallels the river going up towards its headwaters. It does intercept gravel that would otherwise come down from smaller drainages, but sometimes it's not successful in intercepting that, and a big pulse of gravel washes out the road instead. So I think we are seeing a pretty strong sediment supply from upstream.
Michael Rafferty wants to know, have you seen an increased input of wood due to the spruce budworm infestation?
No, we haven't yet, and that is a reference back to the sort of origins of this project, where we saw the large die-off higher in the watershed from spruce budworm, and thought that we'd see more wood added to the river, and it would be smaller diameter wood, and we'd like an opportunity to be trapping that wood and let it form jams. There was a really big fire, Mike, in that part of the watershed, and quite a bit of that dead standing wood actually burned.
The questions are popping in. All right, I'm going to try to get through as many as we can. Dan Scott asks, thinking longer term, decades, is the Teanaway Community Forest being managed to restore large old growth forest patches, especially on landslide prone valley walls or terraces, where that large wood could be available to the river? Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. I don't know much about the long-term forest management plans, and I know William Meyer is on this call. William, are you comfortable speaking briefly to that?
Sure. Hi, Becca. This is William Meyer with Fish and Wildlife, and Travis Serdar with DNR is on the call as well. He and I, Scott Downs, and Joe Smith from DNR have all been working on a forest restoration strategy to do exactly that. Basically, the Teanaway used to be a great place for old growth, great place for old growth dependent species like spotted owls. And I think last year we just had 2 sites active, which was a sort of a shocker, because 25 years ago you used to have like 25 sites. So we've had quite a reduction in those species because of past forestry, climate change, barred owls have moved in, that sort of thing. So we're in the process of coming up with a forest habitat strategy to restore those types of forests to the Teanaway.
Thanks, William.
Let's see, Eastie sent questions directly to Ryan. So Ryan, look in the chat for questions directly to you. And then meanwhile, I'll ask a question from Susan Hess. With climate warming and less snow, how does that figure into your work?
So thanks, Susan. That's been the driver for us, and that's where the emphasis on floodplain connection really comes in. So the thought is that if we can decrease the speed with which water is leaving the watershed, so basically slow down the floods, spread them out across the floodplain, allow that water to infiltrate into the floodplain soils, will be able to dampen that. And when I say that, I'm thinking about the actual drawing of a flood on a graph. We'll be able to push that peak of a flood graph down and keep the water longer in the floodplain. Margaret, I also saw that Jeff had asked about whether anyone was observing the insects in the river. And, you know, I'm not aware that anybody is tracking aquatic insects. There is a professor on campus, on Central Washington University's campus, Clay Arango, who has been looking with the spruce budworm and some of the other forest dynamics to see how that's impacting nutrient cycling in the rivers. But I don't know that he's tracking aquatic insect abundance and diversity. Is anyone else aware of aquatic insect work in the Noth Fork Teanaway?
Easty, do you want to unmute yourself and just ask your questions? Oh,
Yeah.
he has no sound. Maybe not. Lee would like to know, where do the live stakes you plant come from?
Right there. We cut them, well, and by we, I mean Eileen Gowdy, the restoration technician with Yakama Nation, and Washington Conservation Corps AmeriCorps interns collected the live stakes from stands of those species right along the river. So where they could find willow and young cottonwood and alder and dogwood.
And Alan asks, when do you anticipate reintroducing coho salmon to the upper Teanaway? Another excellent question.
I don't know, maybe Gabe and Fred would know exactly when that's happening, unless you know, Ryan.
Soon is all I know, but yeah, I would defer to Gabe and Fred.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me, Ryan.
We hear you, Gabe.
Okay, so, you know, I guess I can't speak to the future too well. That'd be a better question for the Yakama Nation, the coho program. But we did release, I think the first release of salmon from the Jack Creek Acclimation site was actually coho, because we didn't have Chinook to put in there. So they have been released in the past, and I don't know about full scale plans for the future for that facility.
They actually released a raceway full 2 years ago, I think.
So they could be coming back. Would we expect them this year then? This fall?
Yeah, I'd have to look it up. I can't remember exactly when. I can't remember why we did. I think there was something with the raceway issue, and we didn't have enough spring Chinook, so we used coho. And also, there's the coho plan that somebody could look at that and figure out what the timing for the coho to be released from the new hatchery, the Mel Sampson hatchery. But it shouldn't be too long.
I can find out the answer to that. Who asked that question? Get back to them if that works.
That was Alan Murphy.
Hey, Alan.
Okay.
Hi, Becca.
Easty asked, where was the splash dam that you showed with the man standing on the berm upstream of the sluice way? Have you been able to locate this splash dam location on the LiDAR map?
I think it could be anywhere. Somehow we know it's in the Teanaway, but we don't know where it is. Sorry, I wish we knew.
Easty also asked regarding the proposed velocity profile figure. I assume that you reduce the velocity by spreading the flow laterally, since the riverbed and water surface profiles have not changed significantly.
Yeah, I didn't actually mention, but if you looked at the ground, the channel bed elevations, they weren't identical from the bottom to the top, and because I actually adjusted the topographic surface to mimic those gravel augmentation sites. So everything was the same, other than, you know, included those the log jams and removed the portions of the berm and added that gravel to the channel, if that makes sense, and then ran the model over that for the proposed.
And Margaret, I see Jeff's question there. Yeah, the Teanaway does have experienced really low flows in late season. It's partially due to irrigation, but we also see that higher in the watershed above irrigation withdrawals. In fact, we see it up here in the North Fork quite a bit above any place where there are irrigation rights. In the lower part of the river, though, Washington Water Trust has been working to put late season irrigation rights in trust so that producers are irrigating up to a certain point in the summer. And for folks who don't know this watershed, it's mostly hay production in the lower part of the watershed. So they might be choosing to just get one cutting of hay rather than two, and then they put those late season water rights in trust so that the water stays in the river. We also see that the Chinook at least come up earlier and then hold in what pools they can find in the river. So they navigate that low water part of the river when there's still a little more water in it. Susan asked, can the irrigation rights be purchased? Yeah, that's definitely an option too. Oftentimes having them in trust is more palatable to the folks who own the rights because they're not giving up those future opportunities. But yes, they could also be purchased.
Okay, maybe the last question from Dave French. Is this a question? Part of the issue with repeated splash damming and progressive movement upstream for logging splash damming operations is that the downstream sites when the upstream torrent of logs and water is released. In many streams, loggers started downstream, logged the valley bottom, valley walls, splash dam, and stream to clear everything out, then move upstream to the next section. This effectively blows out the pre-existing locations of splash dams downstream. Not a question, but good information. Yeah, thanks, Dave. And thanks everyone for coming. We're gonna have another one of these. We have a few more. Next 2 weeks from now on February 24th is fish recolonization of the White Salmon River, what we know and what we don't know, with Joe Zent from Yakama Nation, Jill Hardiman, and Ian Jazorek from the U.S. Geological Survey. That's going to be great. So you should all come back in 2 weeks. The ones after that, we're going to have kind of an annual meeting about Mid-Columbia Fisheries work. That's March 10th. And then one later in March about smolt out migration and a kickoff to a kind of fun run event that we're holding called Go With The Flow. So we're looking forward to seeing you more in the coming weeks, and we really appreciate everyone coming tonight. If you end up with more questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. I think everyone knows how to contact me, or you can reach me through the Eventbrite site. So thank you so much for coming and have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.